Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We are going to get started here in about 10 minutes, but before we do, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items with those of you that have joined us in the room. For those of you that we do have in the room, the first thing I would like to make mention of is our chat pod, which is located on the left-hand side of your screen marked chat. This chat pod will be the best way to communicate with us if you have any questions regarding today's material. All questions pertaining to the material will be retained until the Q&A session that will be held at the very end of today's webinar. So please feel free at any point of today's discussion to go ahead and type in your questions there for our subject matter expert, and we will pull them out and house them for you, and then we will get them asked during the Q&A session at the very end. This chat pod is also the best way to communicate with us should you experience any technical issues. If you do have any technical issues, please make sure to let us know there in the chat, and either myself or one of our customer service representatives will make sure to get you taken care of. Just a few things about our new platform. We have found out that the best web browsers to view today's event on our new platform are going to be Google Chrome and Mozilla Firefox. If you do have the ability to watch through there, that will give you the best user experience. Also, for any reason, if your audio or your slides should freeze or your video of the live feed should freeze, the best thing to do is to refresh your screen and then simply hit the play button again in the live feed area, and that should refresh your connection. We do also have some closed captions below the live feed, so if you would like to view the closed captions, you will find them there. If for some reason you do experience technical issues, either with the live feed or for some reason your chat pod is not working properly, if you look above the live feed window, you will see our customer support contact number as well as our email address there. So feel free to use those as well should you need any troubleshooting assistance. We are going to get started here in about 6 minutes, but before we do, I would like to ask all of our users that we do have in the room if you could take a few moments to go ahead and type in your location there in the chat pod. That'll give us some great feedback about our audience and where everyone's joining us from today, and just what kind of reach we were able to obtain with today's webinar. Again, we are going to get started here in about 5 or 6 minutes. I'll come on once more to go through housekeeping with the users that come in over the next few minutes, and then we will get started at the top of the hour. Thank you for joining us today. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We are going to get started here in just about 2 or 3 minutes. But before we do, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items with those of you that have joined us in the room. For those of you that we do have in the room, the first thing I would like to make mention of is our chat pod, which is located on the left-hand side of your screen marked chat. Many of you have already found that, but for those of you that have not, this chat pod will be the best way to communicate with us should you experience or should you have any questions regarding today's material. Any questions pertaining to the material will be retained until the Q&A session that will be held at the very end of today's webinar. So please feel free at any point of today's discussion to go ahead and type in your questions there in the chat pod. We would hate for you to forget them. And then we will pull them out and house them for you, and then we will get them asked of our subject matter expert after she is finished with her presentation. This chat pod is also the best way to communicate with us should you experience any technical issues. If you do have any technical issues, please make sure to let us know there in the chat pod, and either myself or one of our customer service representatives will make sure to get you taken care of. All of your audio for today's webinar is going to be streaming through your computer speakers. So if at any point of today's event you either lose your audio or lose your live feed there in the middle of your screen, the best thing that you can do to troubleshoot is to refresh your web browser and then simply hit the play button again on your live feed window, and that should refresh your connection for you. If for some reason that does not fix your issue, then please let us know there in the chat and we will help troubleshoot. Also, above the live feed window, we do have our customer support number and email address there, just in case the chat pod is not working for you or you require some additional assistance. We also do have captions that are going to be live streaming underneath our live feed. So if for any reason you would like to view the captions, they are there for your disposal. I see many of you have already typed in your locations there in the chat pod, but for those of you that have not, if you wouldn't mind taking a few moments before we do get started just to type in where you are viewing today's event from, that'll give us some great feedback and information about our audience as well as the reach we are able to obtain with today's webinar. It is the top of the hour, so I'm going to switch some layups around and then we will be getting started here momentarily. Thank you for joining us today. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Josh Vickers, and I am with RTI International's Forensic Technology Center of Excellence. I will be your host and moderator for today's event. Today's webinar is entitled A Campus-Wide Response to Sexual Misconduct. Our subject matter expert for today is Ms. Elizabeth Seeney. Elizabeth Seeney is the Senior Associate Director of the Office for Institutional Equity and the Interim Title IX Coordinator at the University of Michigan. She left private legal practice in 2013 to join the university's OIE and began investigating student sexual misconduct matters. In her current role, she coordinates the university's compliance with Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972, which includes overseeing student sexual misconduct investigations. Elizabeth's role also involves investigating allegations of various forms of discrimination and discriminatory harassment involving faculty and staff. Additionally, she is working on policy matters related to sexual harassment and other forms of protected class discrimination. Elizabeth regularly presents on Title IX and other civil rights matters. Just our quick disclaimer, the opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this presentation are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect those of the Department of Justice. Any products and manufacturers discussed are presented for informational purposes only and do not constitute product approval or endorsement by the U.S. Department of Justice. And without any further ado, I would like to hand the microphone and platform over to our subject matter expert for today, Ms. Elizabeth Seeney. Elizabeth?
Thank you, Josh, and thanks everyone for being here with me. I'm excited to talk about this. This is obviously, as you can probably tell from my bio, something I spend a lot of time on in my daily life, and there's a lot of interesting things going on in this area now. So I'm excited to talk about this. And do I have control of the screen, Josh?
I'm not seeing your presentation yet, so if you just want to share your screen.
Sorry, I thought we had gotten it all set up. There we go. Sorry about that. So I'm going to be talking about a campus-wide response to sexual misconduct today. And I want to say at the outset of that when I say campus-wide, I really mean a little bit broader than that and encompassing of communities around campus as well. Because I recognize, and you'll probably hear me say this a lot today, that every campus is different. Every college and university has different dynamics in terms of its relationship with the local community, whether it has its own sworn law enforcement or not. And I recognize that there might be a variety of different perspectives listening today and coming to hear and talk about this really important issue. And so when I say campus-wide, we're going to actually talk about campus, but also how campus interacts with both campus law enforcement, campus medical providers, campus supportive resources, but also local community. And we're also going to talk about state and federal law. So it's a little bit broader than campus-wide, but we really are going to focus on campus sexual misconduct. And I'm going to start by just giving a quick overview. We're going to talk a little bit about the context of campus sexual misconduct, because I think that's a lot of what we talk about in the conversation, and certainly what we're here to talk about today is campus sexual misconduct versus sexual misconduct generally. So what is the context about that makes it different, or is there a context that makes it different than any other sexual misconduct to any extent? There certainly is a legal framework, which we'll talk about with the context as well, but related to campus sexual misconduct, where there's an overlap with criminal law and where there is not. And so I'm going to talk about that legal framework that certainly impacts how schools and communities can, should, and must deal with these issues. We're going to talk about resources, providing resources for students, what that can look like, as well as reporting and some of the decision points there in terms of how to craft policies for an institution about encouraging or not encouraging, requiring or not requiring reporting, and then how that interacts with. We'll also talk about different resolution processes that are available, and I am going to focus on resolution processes that are available internal to an institution, but also how those might interact with the criminal justice process as well. We'll talk about interim measures as well as post-resolution measures, what might be appropriate after something has been addressed from an institutional policy perspective. And we'll touch just briefly on prevention efforts and some things to keep in mind in deciding how an institution may want to craft its efforts to prevent sexual misconduct. So starting with the context. So we have a broad national conversation now about sexual misconduct, and this is less true, I think, over the last couple of years, but really the first part of the last decade almost, there was really a lot of focus in that national conversation on campus sexual assault and campus sexual misconduct. That's been a little bit less true since 2017, and we started to kind of move into what, for a brief period of time, some of us refer to as the Harvey Weinstein effect, or you might have heard of, the Harvey Weinstein thing or the Harvey Weinstein effect. And it wasn't very long, actually, that anyone called it that before it became clear that it was much, much, much bigger than just about Harvey Weinstein and became more what is really now more commonly referred to as the Me Too movement or the hashtag Me Too movement I don't know that that even really encompasses everything that's happening in this national conversation. So in the last probably 2 years, this has been a broader conversation and less specifically focused on campus sexual assault, campus sexual misconduct generally. But for the prior couple years, it really was the case that much of the conversation about sexual misconduct, whether sexual assault or other forms of sexual misconduct, was really focused to a large extent, certainly not exclusively, but to a large extent on what's happening on college campuses. There's a couple reasons for that, I think, but it could give the impression, especially prior to 2017 when that focus started to broaden a little bit, it would be easy for people to have gotten the impression that, is this happening more on college campuses than it is anywhere else? And so as we've had this increasing conversation, we also have more research on these issues. So the Association of American Universities is in the process of its second really huge institution campus climate survey on sexual assault and sexual misconduct. And the last one was conducted in 2015. There were 27 institutions of higher education that participated in this very large-scale campus climate survey, where the AAU took standard definitions and applied them to students who responded to the survey at these 27 different institutions to get some data across the board about what people were self-reporting their experience to certain behaviors. And so one thing that I think is always important to note about these is that these questions aren't necessarily things like, have you experienced sexual assault or have you experienced sexual misconduct? They more describe the particular behaviors so that even if someone doesn't necessarily attach that terminology to their experience, they're responding to the particular behavior. So some of the takeaways, and this is a small snippet, there's tons and tons of rich data from this report, but 11.7% of the students who responded to the survey across 27 institutions reported that during the time they've been enrolled at their institution, they had experienced some form of non-consensual sexual contact, so either involving penetration or some other sexual touching that was perpetrated by physical force, threats of physical force, or incapacitation when they didn't have the ability to provide valid consent. Another statistic from that was that 23.1% of female undergraduate students who responded to the survey reported having experienced non-consensual sexual contact, and 5.4% of male undergraduate student survey respondents reported that experience. So these are the numbers from the AAU Campus Climate Survey of what people reported across these 27 institutions. Certainly, this is 27 institutions. This is the people who responded to the survey. It's not, every single student across the country, and it's time sliced. It's a particular time frame, but it is an interesting snapshot. There's been comparisons between the numbers from that study and similar studies done comparing to non-college students between 18 and 24 years old. And of course, not all college students are between 18 and 24 years old, but it's not uncommon for the numbers to be compared between studies. And so one of the takeaways from those comparisons is it looks like, taking two similar studies or looking at similar things, and of course that's always imperfect to do, but looking at two similar studies, it looks like women in college are less likely to experience non-consensual sexual contact than women in the same age range. So women between the ages of 18 and 24 who are enrolled in college are about 20% less likely to experience non-consensual sexual contact than women aged 18 to 24 not in college, according to the comparison of these two. And then the opposite is actually true of men in college. So men between 18 and 24 who are in college are actually significantly, according to comparison of these two particular research reports, are significantly more likely to experience non-consensual sexual contact than men aged 18 to 24 who are not in college. And then the numbers from the AAU Campus Climate Survey, the numbers of students who responded and identified as transgender, genderqueer, or non-conforming, questioning, or indicated that their gender identity was not listed on the survey had rates that were much more similar to those of female student survey respondents. So this is a very small snapshot, of course, so I always want to make that sort of caution that that's just a small piece to look at, and these, of course, are where these numbers are coming from, and I always think it's helpful to read full reports and see the context. But I just wanted to mention that because, again, we have had such a robust conversation for almost a decade now about specifically campus sexual misconduct. And this question comes up of what is different, if anything? Is it because it's happening more? And it doesn't look like, at least for women and at least sort of across the board, that that's necessarily borne out by the numbers. And again, looking at these two particular research reports. But there are some things that can be sort of a unique nature that I think is part of what comes up for people in thinking about campus sexual assault. And I think some of it has to do with the nature of the college experience, in that sort of all-encompassing nature of the experience. So when someone's in college, that's their educational environment for every college student, and recognizing that people have really different experiences, different institutions have different sort of institutional cultures and climates and norms, and every individual student has their own individual experience and involvement in different activities and ways that they interact with the university. But for some students, their educational or their college experience can be not just their educational environment, but also their living environment. They might be living in a residence hall or an off-campus, but somehow affiliated with the university, like a co-op or a fraternity or sorority house. It might still have some connection to their institution. They might be living off campus in a private rental property, but with students and surrounded by other students in private rental properties, which might not be a space that the institution has control over, but that might still be something that sort of is part of their college experience, and that's an ongoing interaction that they have with other students. It can be their working environment. So for some students, they're working at the same college or university that they're attending. So they're a student, but they're also an employee. It can be, for many students, is their primary, or in some cases exclusively, their social environment or their exclusive social environment. Some students are participating in athletics or other activities, other ways that they may interact with the institution. This really sort of all-encompassing nature of something that is happening in interactions with another student, I think can really feel like it's having this sort of all-encompassing impact on every aspect of someone's life, which is not to say that that's not necessarily the case for someone who may feel they've experienced sexual misconduct outside of a campus setting. But I think that's a component of what is compelling to people about sort of looking at campus sexual assault. What are people experiencing, and what are their experiences of how the school responds. I'm going to talk more about another piece, which is sort of the idea that a school would respond. In a couple of minutes, I'm going to talk about the legal framework. But the other thing is that a student's college experience is at least part of their present circumstance. The impact of their college experience extends into their future. And again, this is not to say that someone who experiences disaster isn't impacted in the future if it doesn't happen to them in college. It's just to say that, again, there's that all-encompassing nature, and many of those things continue on in really tangible ways. So I think that's another part of why this can be sort of part of the conversation. And I think that part of what all of this speaks to is the need for what I kind of think of as a willow tree approach. And in full disclosure, I use this metaphor for different aspects of life in general. So it's not just about campus sexual misconduct, but I think it really fits here too, that I think of one of the things that can be tricky for institutions and for their partners in the broader community of addressing these issues is the need to take the willow tree approach in the sense that you need to be very consistent, have this really strong, solid foundation. That sort of feels really structured and inflexible sometimes. And at the same time, these are real people living real daily experiences that are very, very diverse in terms of what their experiences are and what their needs are. And so there really needs to be flexibility to adapt. Every student is different, every case is different, and the legal framework and the expectations of campus community members can change very quickly, and every campus has its own culture. And so I think of that sort of contrast between really needing this strong foundation and roots that aren't really going to change much quickly, at least. You know, they're really kind of what they are, and they need to be really solid and really rock solid and really steady. But there also needs to be this ability to kind of flow and adapt to what might be changing in some cases very quickly, or what might be you know, situation of first impression, so to speak, a situation that a Title IX coordinator or police officer has never necessarily experienced before in terms of navigating different ways that students may interact with other while these situations are being addressed in some way. So I want to touch on that for a second, the overlap with criminal law, and we'll come back to this and talk quite a bit about this overlap and how this can play out throughout our time today, because there is quite a bit of overlap between institutional policy, which is most of what we will be talking about today, is how do schools respond and how do community partners respond with schools, or work with schools, and how do schools work with partners, about institutional policy around sexual misconduct. And there will necessarily be significant sexual assault, domestic violence, and partner violence, if those are covered under an institutional policy, as many institutions cover stalking, some forms of sexual misconduct. Some policies might refer to this as a form of sexual harassment or sexual exploitation in terms of taking videos or pictures of someone and engaged in sexual activity, or undressed, or sharing those in a way that could be criminal and also a violation of an institutional policy. But in other areas, a school's policy won't necessarily overlap with criminal law. So it wouldn't necessarily be criminal for a person to engage in a series of inappropriate sexualized comments, or to really persistently someone out with sexual innuendos and passages. But that might be something that could be implicated, or could implicate a university's policy, either as a policy violation, depending on the circumstance, or just as behavior that's considered inappropriate. And even if it wouldn't necessarily be addressed as a potential policy violation, it might be something that or an institution. So in some places, there's going to be overlap, and in some places there won't. And then obviously there are tons and tons of crimes that have nothing to do with sexual misconduct. So those, of course, would be areas that do not overlap as well. So when there is this overlap, who responds and when, and how can educational institutions best coexist, but even ideally coordinate in a way that's appropriate, recognizing that, of course, these are different processes, there's different definitions, there's different possible outcomes, there's different evidentiary standards, and so complete coordination is not appropriate, but and there's also limits on how enforcement can share information and how educational institutions what information is. So how can they at the very, very least, coexist in a healthy way and ideally coordinate in a way that's healthy and appropriate and serves all students as well. And I think there's kind of three things to think about when educational institutions and their law enforcement partners, whether this is campus police, whether this is a local law enforcement agency, or maybe some combination. So they think about how they're working together. One thing is compliance. So I think one thing I want to mention, thinking about the overlap with criminal law, is, if you read the comments, news articles that are available on the internet, which don't recommend, but I have done it from time to time, to deep regret. And like I said, not something I recommend, but if you have done that, or if you ever find yourself curious and decide to read the comments, one of the things that comes up, and it's a fair question, and it's not, well, I don't recommend reading the comments. I'm not, critical of asking questions, certainly, but that people will say, why is there even this question? Why would we ask how educational institutions? Why would they? Why don't schools just report these things to the police and be done with it and let the police figure it out from there? Fair enough. But one of the answers to that is compliance, and there are other answers as well. But it's actually so first I would say, again, there's not complete and total overlap. So it wouldn't be appropriate necessarily for a report of sexual harassment that doesn't involve a crime. That might be inappropriate comments, threats, nothing that implicates law. That wouldn't be the best way to try to address that, to shoehorn it into a process where it's not against the law, it's not a crime, that's not the best use of that resource to address something that ultimately can't be prosecuted. So that's part of it, is there are these spaces where there is no overlap. But even where there is, certainly that's a question that comes up quite a bit, is why don't just report this? Why don't institutions report it to the police and stay out of it? And so part of it is that there are laws that require institutions to address these things. Related, some of those laws are civil rights laws, which are related to access to education. But that's part of it, is one of the things to look to and answer these questions about who responds if both an institution and a law enforcement agency, or I recognize that sometimes, like at the institution where I am in Michigan, there are law enforcement agencies that are connected, that are part of the university. So I don't mean to say those as separate things, but if it's an administrative process or office inside the university, or whether it's law enforcement, is it both? And then what's the timing on that? Same time, does one respond first? If one responds before the other, do they do their full process before the other responds? And what does that look like? And so when these entities are thinking about this, and hopefully they're kind of thinking about it and talking about it together, one of the things that they would think about, and when they're thinking about how can they best coexist and coordinate, is compliance. What are the laws, the federal laws, in terms of reporting to one another, particularly institutions reporting to law enforcement? What are the federal laws in terms of privacy? How does information that the police have received available to schools that might be separate from that law enforcement agency? When can an educational institution, and they don't have a legal obligation to report something, they have a legal obligation not to their particular, and state laws as well. So part of it is and another piece of it is sort of the campus climate and the expectations. Also something to consider in answering these questions: who responds and when, and how can we work together? So to some extent, sometimes the compliance and the campus climate quite often actually are a little bit of a chicken egg question, or a little bit of they have a little bit of a cyclical effect. So we can be doing something because it's what our community expects, and that can increase the likelihood of that being ultimately, encoded in some type of legislation or policy, which sort of sets and furthers a particular climate or a particular community expectation, and so on. So that's something to think about too, is what is the community's expectation with respect to whether a school should report to law enforcement when they learn of something. Law enforcement be reporting to the Title IX coordinator or Title IX office, whatever structure may be at the institution, when they learn of something that may or may not be a crime and might be also a policy violation, and are they expecting the agencies to work together, the offices to work together? And that campus climate is also an answer to that question of why don't schools just report to the police? Done with it. It's because they have legal obligations to respond, and they also have obligations to their community, values and commitment, create a safe environment so that their students can access those educational programs. They have those obligations as well to address reports of behavior that are in policies and institutional values and expectations. And I think finally the thing this is more of a logistical answer to the question, and in particular to how do we coexist and coordinate, is to emphasize this repeatedly today. Hopefully not too much in the style of a broken record, but you'll hear me talk a lot about communication, not just with law enforcement, but with various offices across a campus, because I think this is absolutely critical to ensuring that these matters and these concerns that students may raise are addressed in a way that's not just legally compliant, but also effective and appropriate and consistent with that communication, and particular kind of about these questions. And again, I really mean it when I'm saying I hope that these are things that institutions are sitting down with either their institutional law enforcement or their local law enforcement to say, where are areas of overlap in our policy? What are things that could come up? How can we share that information? That's the most appropriate way to share that, or is it not? And what are the legal obligations to do that or not do that? What does all that look like? What works for you? What works for us? And of course, everybody always has to comply with the law. So that's a particular part of it as well. And what is appropriate for what works for our campus, recognizing that every institution has a little bit of a different culture and different nature of the institution. So moving on, I'm going to talk quickly about the legal framework because that impacts.
Elizabeth, I hate to interrupt you, but we're having some audio issues. It's cutting out here and there. No. Would you mind just making sure that you're projecting your voice at your microphone, and we'll see if that corrects it. If not, we might try to utilize a different audio line.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Let me know if it continues, and I will do my best.
All right. Thank you.
Sure. So we talk a lot talking about these issues about Title IX, and Title IX has plenty kind of different components in terms of the legal framework in and of itself, but there are others as well. So without going into too much detail on this, Title IX is a federal civil rights statute that essentially prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex. It applies to educational institutions that receive any form of federal funding at all. So the vast majority, almost all institutions of higher education, are required to comply with Title IX and not engage in discrimination on the basis of sex. So it's really about access to education and sort of that piece, both in terms of compliance and culture about why schools are involved in this, is that the access to education, that sexual misconduct can get in the way of someone doing what they're at an institution to do, to learn, to work, to engage in activities, etc. So there's the statute itself, which really doesn't say much more than I just said. about sex discrimination, quite short. There are regulations that are also to date fairly brief. Those are also, legally enforceable and give a little bit more specific criteria about how schools need to go about not engaging in sex discrimination, addressing sex discrimination. There's guidance and there's case law. And through guidance and case law, we really fleshed out. Title IX initially had a lot to do with literal access to academic programs and discrimination on the basis of sex in that context. And then over time, certainly what I grew up with was when you heard about Title IX, you heard about it in terms of athletics. And I guess I'm situating myself in a particular time frame there. But really had a lot to do with equal access to participation in athletics. And then really in the last decade or so, it's really been focused much more, at least in terms of the public conversation and perception. It is still absolutely about access to academic programs and athletic programs and any other program or benefit that an institution offers. But really much more of the conversation is about how schools address sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is considered legally a form of sex discrimination. And so in order to comply with Title IX and avoid discriminating on the basis of sex, an institution needs to have a thorough and appropriate response to allegations of sexual misconduct or sexual harassment that are happening at the school. A significant player in the legal framework here, a significant piece of the legal framework, is the Violence Against Women Act, particularly the 2013 reauthorization, which amended the Clery Act. And it took some of the guidance from Title IX. There's also the Department of Education will put out guidance saying, here's what we need, or kind of flesh out some expectations. It's not quite legally enforceable in the way that a statute or regulations would be. And then, of course, there's also case law where courts will interpret legal statutes, and that becomes binding for institutions as well. So the Violence Against Women Act, when it was reauthorized the second most recent time, in 2013, took some things that were guidance and kind of put them into another law, and it created some additional requirements for schools in terms of process and ensuring equal access for both parties in a resolution process at a school, training obligations, and also ways that information is shared with the community, and some requirements about really making sure that people know about their options and their resources. And then another significant piece of the legal framework here is the due process. For public institutions, the Constitution is at play, and so due process is really important in processes to resolve or address complaints of sexual misconduct. In private institutions, these more from a legal perspective show up as breach of contract claims. But really, even aside from the legal framework, the fairness of the process is it's embedded throughout all of these of the legal framework, and also is a part of, generally speaking, a part of schools' sort of institutional values in addressing these. And then not specifically related to sexual misconduct, but what can also be very much a play in how schools and their campus and community partners address sexual misconduct is the Family Educational Right and Privacy Act that restricts how institutions can share information as part of a student's education. That component. And then some states increasingly actually have laws either about the way that institutions respond to whether or not they report to police. For example, some states might have a state law requiring the report of felonies to law enforcement. There are increasingly state laws about reporting out to the public about the number of reports and how they're addressed and other things. So these are all sort of things that institutions need to be mindful of when they're looking at these questions about coordinating comprehensive responses to concerns of sexual misconduct. So these are a couple ways that I've seen institutions implement in order to sort of connect their Title IX coordinator or Title IX investigators or Title IX office, whatever it is, vastly different structures at different institutions. Connect the people that are sort of day to day really focused on student sexual misconduct with people who are in a sort of university's response way, with people who have other roles in addressing student issues generally or specifically sexual misconduct. So one example of this would be a campus or community SART team. These are SART stands for Sexual Assault Response Team. That's not to imply that this would be limited specifically to assault. This could be used for other sexual misconduct allegations as well. So this could be a team that could include some combination of, for example, a Title IX coordinator, Title IX investigators. It could be law enforcement would be common, either campus law enforcement or local law enforcement. Medical service providers. So if an institution has a student health center, particularly if they provide sane forensic exams, but even if they don't, if they're seeing students, or if they don't, or in addition to having a student health center, then a local, clinic or hospital, particularly wherever would be the place that students would be most likely to go for sane exams, or if they've experienced severe injury of partner violence, would be good sort of partners to put together on these SART teams to talk about. And I've seen these look at sort of like an individual response, but also this can tend to be something that's more a place for people with these different perspectives to connect on how are things going in our overall campus and community response to this issue. So are we running into problems with, does one office have enough information about another place that they should be also referring to? They're making these disclosures. And how can we sort of shore up those practices to make sure that we have that information to give to students? Or is one office hearing about a concern that's coming up when students are going to use another resource? And just sort of coordinating to make sure that everyone is on the same page and able to share information with one another, sort of ensure best practices in responding to students. Similar to this, but a little bit different, is a campus case management team. So this might be more focused on individual cases and response to Title IX reports or reports received by the Title IX coordinator. So this could be, for example, the Title IX coordinator, Title IX investigators. It might be law enforcement would be extremely important and helpful to include on these. This could be a student conduct office if that's separate from the Title IX office. If there's a non-confidential support office, something like a dean of students office or some other office that would be a support resource for students for general kind of issues or behavioral issues or general concerns that are impacting them. For people to kind of stay connected, this could also be a place where you might have someone from housing or athletics or Greek life that sort of has a closer, particularly I think for larger institutions, that has kind of a closer look at particular, smaller pockets of campus or student population, to be able to kind of make sure we're all connecting on, are there interim measures that are necessary? Are there struggles that this student is having that they haven't maybe brought up to a particularly a specific support resource or to the investigator or whatever it might be? Are they going through a criminal investigation and some type of campus institutional process at the same time? How are those things tracking and how are they coordinating? And is one of those processes causing a delay or an issue in the other? Or do we need to slow down one of those processes to avoid interfering with the other? And just to kind of touch base on a more case-specific way versus the SART being likely sort of a more general, a look at general responses and practices. One thing to note about both of these is if you have, whether it's law enforcement, advocates, or medical care providers, or anyone else that's a local partner from the local community and not inside of the campus, is just really being mindful of the best way of sharing information and what information should and should not, or can and cannot, under applicable laws, be shared in that way, so that you're not having an issue of someone getting information that then it's not actually appropriate for them to have and use, or having a breach of students' privacy that's not appropriate. But this also, and I'll talk more about this in a minute, one of the purposes is to have really open communication. We just want to be really careful if you are outside, and really even when you're sort of internal to the institution, just mindful of sort of that need to know and limits to confidentiality. So collaborative advisory groups can also be helpful to have, whether it's a Title IX coordinator or a dean of students, that they might sit on one another's to kind of look at these types of issues and provide advice and guidance. Collaborative educational efforts, so taking a team approach to providing training and education to students as well as to faculty and staff, is also another way that that different offices and stakeholders across campus might partner together to try to sort of amplify one another and increase their impact in addressing these issues. And so the benefits to all of these are a couple of things. One is to provide a framework and a baseline for regular communication. So again, I can't stress enough how important communication is in addressing issues and in setting up really strong practices for providing a good response to students. So this sets up a framework and a baseline where, if nothing else, I know I'm going to talk to this group every other Wednesday or whatever it is, or every week or once a month. Whatever it is, there's that baseline where no matter what, even if nothing's going on, we have this meeting and we're going to connect, even if it's just around the table and say, there's nothing to talk about. There's almost always going to end up being something to talk about once you get around the table. And it provides that framework, and it really encourages partnership, and it fosters the really critical relationship so necessary. Again, we talked at the very beginning about how, varying from student to students really have a lot going on in many cases that connects them to their university in a bunch of different ways. And so having these relationship buildings really in the long run, not only does it make our jobs easier, and it certainly does, in my experience, make our jobs much easier, and it makes us better able to do them in a way that really serves and benefits our students. That is just absolutely critical. I cannot emphasize that enough. This relationship building, communication, and collaborative partnerships, and having these types of teams and regular meetings and advisory groups and collaborative endeavors together really helps to build those relationships and really helps everyone to kind of recognize we are all in this together. This is difficult work. These are tough things, and we, want to do the best we can for our students. And so seeing people as sort of partners and allies in this can be extremely, extremely helpful for our benefit as well as the benefit of our students. And this can also promote cross-education about different resources that are available on campus, different processes that might be options for students that might have some complex concerns, different entities just to know kind of what's available on campus, and to get different perspectives on these issues. So I think it's helpful to know more about kind of some of the resources that are available on campus that might not be the standard kind of 5 offices that we think of right away when we think about sexual misconduct resources: our counseling office, our advocacy office, our respondent support office, our law enforcement, and our office for institutional equity or Title IX office, and our student conduct office, that you can got a little bit broader lens on that to think about. Housing, fraternity and sorority life or Greek life, athletics, academic advising, or different offices that might bring a different perspective and might have a role to play in different ways in addressing these concerns, whether it's part of a resolution process or whether it's part of supporting students and providing resources for them. Also helpful to know about different policies and different processes that might not seem to immediately really directly touch or connect with sexual misconduct, but might turn out to in practice. So, for example, an institution might have a complaint of hazing in an organization where some component of it involves sexualized behavior, but for whatever variety of reasons, it might not be that the sexual misconduct policy or those processes or options are the most appropriate or effective ways to address the concern. So it could be sexualized conduct, but that's only a really small piece of it. And the rest of it doesn't really fit in that bucket, but it's still important to address and to look into and respond to in some way. And so knowing having these groups can help to, for Title IX coordinators and others to say, to think creatively about maybe a piece of this belongs over here and is best addressed here, but we don't have to just feel hopeless sending students away saying, but I don't know what to tell you about the rest of it, because we have more access to information about these other processes that might be available under hazing policy through a different rule, or this code of, the student code of conduct through the student conduct office, or whatever other options might be available. And having some of those collaborative groups can help to give us a better understanding of those, which ultimately helps us to connect our students in the right places. And then, of course, having diverse perspectives, tremendously helpful. Going back to kind of that idea of the willow tree, there are lots of times where we really have to stick to that strong foundation and those roots always, but be able to adapt and kind of flow a little bit to adapt to a unique situation and find some creative solutions to make sure that we're addressing a particular, a student's particular and unique situation and circumstances in a way that's fair, that's legally compliant, and that really meets their particular needs. And then finally, particularly with respect to a case management group or a SART team, this can help facilitate the assessment of patterns. So, and this also is another point to emphasize the importance of communication between partnership between a Title IX office and institutional or local law enforcement, because if I am getting one report about someone as the Title IX coordinator that maybe on its face isn't necessarily serious enough to constitute, it's not severe, it's a one-time incident and not severe enough to constitute a violation of the university's sexual misconduct policy, but there might be other criminal complaints, or if one report is made to the Title IX office and one report is made to law enforcement, et cetera, and putting together sort of that information to be able to facilitate an assessment of patterns. And patterns can be, is this one thing where a number of disclosures have been made and we're getting the same incident reported a number of times? That's helpful to know and make those connections. That can prevent a situation where a complainant is getting kind of a second hand, where sometimes if you don't know who the complainant is, they're not identified, it's reported by a third party who doesn't have an obligation to identify the complainant. We'll ask them to pass on the resource information that we would provide to them directly. So if they're having that conversation with a handful of people across campus, that whole handful of people is reporting it and then agreeing to provide those resources. We're bombarding that student with information about resources, which, it's very important to make sure that that information gets across, but no one wants to be bombarded with it. So that can be helpful. Assessing patterns can also be, is this a serial perpetrator? Is this a climate or cultural issue in a particular residence hall, academic program, organization? Is this an physically unsafe area of campus? Is there something that we can do to address this? Or is this a, say residence hall, academic program, organization, etc., where there's been really good training about reporting and about the options available, and so there might not be more happening there, but it might be a place where we can say, hey, this training has really been effective in having people know how to report, and we can get that information by talking to each other. And then finally, this can help increase visibility for all of these entities and increase access across populations. So it can be helpful for students to see that the Title IX office and the law enforcement, are allies and work together and cooperate and aren't, wanting students to pick one or the other in some sort of unhealthy way, and to see that there's a healthy interaction and collaboration between the student office and a Title IX office and a office or whatever it might be. This can help kind of build trust and ultimately, at the end of the day, get students the information they need. They can make decisions about processes that they may or may not want to pursue and resources that they may or may not find helpful. So, speaking of sort of reporting and resources, I'm going to move into talking a little bit first about reporting and what schools may sort of think about in deciding their policies around reporting, and then about some resources and how really to make sure that we're structuring resources in a way that they're not just helpful on paper, but that they really work to help our students be supported. So thinking about reporting, one of the things that I think is important about reporting is that it's a bridge to information about options and information about supportive resources. So that makes sort of a lens at which I look at reporting in a really positive way, which raises the question of, should institutions encourage reporting? And a related question is, when should institutions require reporting? So these are very different things, and there's sort of competing, and we'll talk about sort of there's legal obligations around when institutions require reporting. So under Title IX, institutions have an obligation to identify what's called responsible employees. This makes me think of someone who shows up on time and does their work in a timely manner and does a good job and spell checks their reports and proofreads. But what it actually means is someone who has a responsibility as part of their job to report concerns, Title IX coordinator. And then campus security authorities, the term under the Clery Act. So responsible employee is a Title IX term. It refers to an obligation to report sexual misconduct related to an institution policy to the institution's Title IX program. Campus security authorities, the Clery Act term, which refers to an obligation to report certain crimes occurring in certain locations to the campus law enforcement or the Department of Public Safety and Security or local, whatever your applicable law enforcement agency is at your institution. There's, again, quite a bit of overlap at many institutions with positions. And the law is also a little bit like our willow tree in that legal framework also has some components of it that are really sort of strong fundamental roots. A lot of places where there's not specifics, which can be viewed as a good thing or a bad thing. And one of the good things is that it allows schools that flexibility again to go with, adapt to their situations and to change obligations and circumstances. So with respect to the obligations, those can sometimes be also strong roots, but then you can sort of figure out as an institution what works on your campus for who is a responsible employee, who specifically has those obligations to report. So that's something for institutions to think really critically about. When do they want to require reporting? Increasingly, it seems there are some institutions that have tended to say that all university employees And that's not to say this is the majority. I don't know if that's the case, but there are institutions that are saying that all university employees have obligations to report. And there are sort of competing principles that are both extremely valid when it comes to thinking about requiring or short of requiring reporting. And the principles are a little bit in tension. And one is a strong value for offering people with concerns autonomy make decisions about what happens with their concerns and what happens with their information. And that's important. And many people and institutions hold that to be a very significant value. Another principle that's also extremely important and may at times be in tension with that is institutions can't do anything about something they don't know anything about it. And so the obligations to campus safety and climate to address concerns cause many institutions to feel like they want to increase reporting through requirements of reporting. And then if there is an institution to make everyone required to report, should the institutions take a stance on encouraging reporting, or should they just draw the requirement line and then let people do what they will without encouragement one way or another? And these are things we need to think about, I think, sort of what students' expectation is. That's actually part of the consideration and analysis of who would be considered a responsible employee. Would a student reasonably expect that this person would have the authority to address a concern of sexual misconduct? And something to think about from a cultural perspective. What would faculty and staff expect in terms of what their obligations would be, and in terms of what others' obligations would be, and where does the institution fall sort of on those principles of wanting to address concerns, but also not wanting to impose processes or outcomes upon someone who may not be interested in reporting concerns that they have. So those are things that there's no one size fits all answer in terms of reporting. What is really important, though, is that every report that does happen, whether it's required or it's voluntary, is that every report should be followed up with appropriate information about options available to someone with concerns that are available. So even if the options might be limited, and we'll talk about when options might be available or not available for various processes, even if those options might be limited, providing some information about them allows someone to make a decision about whether they want to pursue those or not. And similarly, providing information about resources and an offer to help connect someone directly with resources can really help to ensure that students have the support that they need on campus. And then also important when thinking about these sort of policy decisions about encouraging reporting and or requiring reporting, to think about what legal obligations there might be with respect to minors on campus, whether they're students who have started college before turning 18, whether they're participants, high school students or younger, or whatever the situation might be, what obligations might some individuals on campus have about that. And then finally, a distinction or really just information about reporting to the institution. What does that look like? What does reporting to law enforcement look like? Very important for schools to let students know their right to report crimes to law enforcement. So that's critical, that in receiving a report of something that could be a crime, that students are made aware that because there is this area of overlap, don't want to have a student feeling like they can only report to the school or they can only report to law enforcement when those both may be available options to them. So that's extremely important for schools to let students know that, and extremely important to be conscious of when a school or some school officials might have an obligation to report to law enforcement. Either a legal obligation, as a campus security authority, they'd have to provide some level of information with some level of perhaps limited detail, or whether they have some other legal obligation under, say, a state law that requires reporting to law enforcement, or whatever the reason might be, or whether it's an institutional policy or practice of particular school officials reporting or sharing information. What does that look like for students? Does that mean that when a report comes into the Title IX coordinator, they call the police and a uniformed officer goes to meet immediately? Does that mean that they submit a form online or call over to the law enforcement agency and they then reach out to the student to see if they want to talk to them? What does it mean exactly when there are those notifications happening? And the really, really key thing here, again, there's no one size fits all for every institution and what exactly this looks like. The really key things are, of course, it has to fit within the applicable legal framework for that institution, and transparency for students so that they're aware. If I share this information with a particular person on campus, I know what I can expect in terms of who that information is going to be shared with. If I report to law enforcement, I know that it is or is not going to be reported to the Title IX office. If I report to the Title IX office, I know that it is or is not going to be shared with law enforcement. That transparency is really important. So I'm putting together resources. It's really critical that there be supportive resources available regardless of whether a student wants to pursue any particular process. So designating certain resources confidential can ensure that students have a place that they can go and talk openly about concerns without having sort of a process or a report imposed upon them if that's not what they want at that time. Again, very important to make sure that there's transparency around the limits on that confidentiality, whatever they might be. So if it's a confidential resource with limited exceptions for threats of harm to self or others, then that's important for people to know. If it's not a fully confidential location and it's someone who would have an obligation to they're a responsible employee or have some obligation to report some types of things. That's important for students. Really important for people to have the ability to make informed choices around kind of what resources and options they might find helpful. So that transparency and letting people know what resources are available and how they work. And exploring partnerships with community resources can help expand access. So if an institution doesn't have the resources to offer a fully staffed 24/7 confidential, crisis intervention, counseling, et cetera, advocacy office, then they may want to explore a partnership with a community resource that can serve in that role in some type of formal or informal way, can serve in that role for students. Or it can be helpful to have those types of partnerships and to promote awareness among student communities of local resources, even if there are institutional resources that offer overlapping services, so that people, again, have as much choice as possible. Really critical to ensure equitable resources for complainants, respondents, witnesses. Sometimes can find these situations particularly distressing as well, people reporting concerns, and for students, faculty, and staff. So really important to ensure equitable resources across student populations and without respect to what their role in a concern or in a situation might be. So it's not sufficient to only offer support to respondents or only offer support to some level of resources available to everyone. And then critical not just to have them, but also to look at how do we reduce or eliminate barriers that may exist to accessing those resources to be effective. So taking a holistic and comprehensive view of how various student populations might access particular resources can be really helpful. We all have things that we might not see at first glance or might not immediately think of. And so really doing a good comprehensive review of how there might be barriers. So physical location, is this in a space that's physically safe? Is it geographically convenient to where students are likely to be? If you have multiple campuses, their access physical access to a particular resource on all of the different campuses? Is it in a remote location? What about physical accessibility? Are the entrances physically accessibility? If you have a student who uses a wheelchair, are they able to physically access the space and the location? And the physical environment, does it feel the room where you might be meeting with someone for support or for to identify some academic measures or whatever? Does it feel like an interrogation room? Is it a comfortable place to meet, and that physical environment play out? Digital accessibility, so information available on websites, certainly available on mobile devices, and are those going to be accessible to students who may have a disability, a visual impairment, making sure that information is also accessible in a variety of formats to everybody. And then linguistic accessibility, or materials available in different languages that might be relevant to the student population. Having a variety of resources, so again, recognizing that institutions have different structures, different resources, and different sort of institutional cultures, offering a variety of resources. A counseling center might be different from an academic advising, which might be different from advocacy or crisis intervention. And a variety of means to access resources. So just thinking about, and again, it doesn't mean that all of these things are always immediately feasible to a particular purpose, but thinking about, we offer services in person. Someone have to make an appointment, or can they just for the hours that the staff are available? Are we available by phone, email, instant messaging chat, video chat? Are there ways to reach out on social media? Are there scheduled events that might be a good place for people to kind of start out to access a resource or learn more about those options? And thinking also about sort of representation and the inclusivity and conception of a resource to ensure that it is really very accessible and welcoming, and that students can feel comfortable accessing it. So have a resource that has Women's Center or signifies a particular gender in the name, that's not uncommon, but might not feel inclusive to male or non-binary students. Our resource is perceived by students to be primarily white spaces or primarily female spaces, primarily Greek life spaces or spaces that are hostile to Greek life, students in Greek life organizations, student athlete spaces or spaces that are hostile to student athletes, primarily heterosexual spaces, primarily cisgender spaces. How are the students perceiving them? Are there different populations that are represented in the staff, in the promotional materials, on the website, inclusive language? And are the promotional materials clear as to the services offered and any requirements for eligibility? So if a resource is available to students, do they have to be enrolled at this moment? If a student is drawn and they're planning on returning the next semester, that's helpful for them to know so they don't go across campus to access a resource and then find out it's not actually available to them at this time. So thinking very quickly about the variety of resources, it can be helpful to have counseling or crisis intervention that's offered for students, advocacy in a variety of ways, medical wellness resources that students can access in a affordable way, and then supportive measures where the institution help them with academic struggles, if they need change in their housing or dining, if there's an employment issue or extracurricular activities, and again, medical and wellness measures that the school can take that's really just supporting one student without impacting another. I want to leave a little time for questions, so I'm going to speak pretty quickly about resolution processes and just touch quickly on prevention efforts, and then leave a little time for some questions. So resolution processes is one of the places where a lot of the conversation happens, where sometimes people don't feel like they've had the best experience when they've reported a concern. And I think it's helpful for schools to think about what types of resolution processes they are able to offer and when and what those would look like. So primarily we're talking about adjudicative responses. We may also be talking about some adaptable resolution processes, and sometimes there are other responses like providing individual education, providing education to the broader community, and sometimes others. Again, this idea of a willow tree where we have our policies and procedures and laws as they are right now are really that laws are kind of both in the sense that that you have that really solid framework, but you also then have that flexibility to adapt to maybe there's some other response that's the most appropriate. And as long as it is in keeping with your policies and your framework, it's okay to think creatively and be flexible. The resolution processes must always be equitable. That is a fundamental, critical characteristic of any, whether it's adjudicative, whether it's an adaptable resolution process or something else. It must be equitable. Determining what process is appropriate. So I first think in a particular case, so what processes are available? And this is going to be determined by the policy and by the capacity and expertise in order to offer up a process. So you have to have people that are trained to implement the processes that you're offering. If you're offering a process, you have to be able to carry it out competently and effectively. So availability might be determined in a particular case by the policy, and whether it's a policy violation or whether it's not particularly at that level. Of those options, then, does the complainant want, if any? If there's a potential policy violation and the complainant is interested in an adjudicative process, then that should occur. If the complainant wants to pursue an adaptable resolution process, then does someone else that they want to, whether it's the respondent or others, to participate in that with them? Are they also agreeing to do that? We'll talk just a tiny bit more about adaptable resolution measures in just a second, but just to touch quickly on the variety of adjudicative processes and what that structure can look like. It's important for schools to consider what works best for them, again, keeping in mind the legal framework. So there's a single investigator model, there are a variety of hearing models, and then there's a hybrid where maybe there's an investigation that then results in a hearing. So keeping in mind the legal framework, I have a little asterisk here because at this time, public institutions in the Sixth Circuit must have a hearing for any student sexual misconduct case where suspension of the respondent is a possible sanction and credibility is an issue. And so it's very common then in the Sixth Circuit for hearings to be offered for many or all student sexual misconduct cases consistent with current case law in the Sixth Circuit. So that's also based on the Department of Education's notice of proposed rulemaking. We don't know where that will land in terms of future regulations. The proposal includes a requirement of hearings for all institutions of higher education. Whether that will be included in the final regulations or not, we don't know. But keeping in mind that schools at this time have some ability to, even if they're required to have a hearing, to look at what is the most effective way of doing that and what works for that school. Again, sticking within that legal framework and having the flexibility to make it work for their campus in a way that's legal and equitable as well. And then again, thinking about who determines sanctions, what input do parties have, are appeals offered, if so, to whom, what can they appeal, findings, sanctions go, on what grounds. If you have to have a live hearing to assess credibility, you probably can't have an appeal of the finding based on sufficiency of the evidence. Are appeals decided by internally or externally, or by one person, by a panel, etc. So these are places where, as long as you stick within the legal framework, schools can sort of make it work for them. So adjudicative processes are always going to need to be fair, impartial, free from bias, thorough. There must be equal access for the parties to participate, share information, identify witnesses, identify or provide evidence, have the right to an advisor of their choosing in the process. And again, schools always need to consider their legal obligations under both federal and state laws may apply to a particular institution, their own campus culture, and then again, the institutional resources. You can have the best policy and the best procedures, but if you don't have the resources to implement them in an appropriate way, it doesn't do a lot of good to have that policy and processes. It's really important to be mindful of the resources and the capacity to carry out the processes in the way that a school is designing them. So who will do the work? What is the volume of cases? And what's the capacity to handle them in all these different ways? Questions to consider also, who reviews or supervises the work? Who are going to be the decision makers at each point? Who's making a finding of a violation or no violation? Who's determining sanctions? Who's deciding appeals? What are the balances on those decisions? So I want to return just briefly to a note about adaptable processes. These can be offered. They must be voluntary by all parties involved. So these can be another option if the parties are interested in pursuing it, to allow greater autonomy and flexibility so that parties can pick what they feel works for them. It's just critical that students not be pushed or coerced into a particular process, and their participation has to be voluntary. These are also not appropriate for every case. It's important for institutions to think about how they'll assess whether an adaptable process would be available for a particular case and who makes that decisions, and then who will facilitate those processes. And again, you need to consider the capacity. How many do you have? How many students do you have every year asking for these? What's the time commitment in terms of staffing? And then do you have the competence and the expertise to carry out an adaptable process in a student sexual misconduct case? That's a particularly specific situation. And what is the campus culture around the use of adaptable processes? And then thinking about other options that might be available. Again, there's room for flexibility and creative thinking around how concerns can be addressed, particularly if you have maybe a complainant that doesn't want to participate in a process. There might be other ways that either the students involved in any way can be supported, that education can be provided that doesn't necessarily involve investigating and making a finding as to whether a student violated policy or not. There might be ways to support the students and address concerns in other ways, as long as you're sticking within that really strong foundation of your policies and procedures, and you're offering equitable resources, equitable processes, and equitable participation in processes. There is room for flexibility to think about, is this a place where we can offer community education, or we can offer an individual some educational efforts? Some institutions will require that in a separate way. I think that's something to think about, whether that's appropriate to do or whether it should be an offer. In all cases, though, information about options and the availability of supportive measures and access to resources that information is really key. So a final kind of closing thing about interim measures. Again, so interim measures being things that a school can do during a process or once it's received a report to support students. So again, flexibility and creative thinking is really important. There is no one-size uniform solution. Every student is different, and their circumstances and needs are always going to differ. And sometimes for the same student from semester to semester. So interim measures should be as closely tailored to the specific circumstances and needs of the party as possible. You really can't just use a one-size uniform solution and expect that it will work well for everyone. Protective measures, where you're requiring or implementing something that impacts a student who does not ask for it, can be implemented as appropriate. There should be due process wrapped around those. Supportive measures, though, that are only impacting the person who's requesting them are almost always appropriate if they're reasonable and feasible to do. So questions for institutions to think about are, who should make these decisions? And then should that be the person who implements them and is on the ground making the measures happen, or is that someone else? And if so, who? And again, coordination and communication are just really key in making sure that those happen and they go well and go smoothly. After a resolution process, like an adaptable resolution or an investigation or hearing, protective measures may no longer be appropriate. But there might be sanctions if there's been a finding of a violation of policy. Sanctions could be imposed that could reflect some of the same needs that the protective measures were implemented to address, or resolution agreements that the student might agree to following, for example, an adaptable process. Really important to continue to prohibit retaliation and to address concerns that do come up related to retaliation even after a process has been completed. Schools need to use good faith in their dealings with all involved individuals and treat all students equitably. And just think about, are there other steps or processes that might need to occur in a particular situation? Sometimes there are impacts on a residence hall, a student organization, a friend group even, where there might be some other things that really need to happen to kind of address a lasting impact of even a report being made, regardless of what the finding or process has been. And keeping in mind that all the students involved may need ongoing support. It can feel to us like the case is, it's done when it's done, but it's not. That's not the case for people who are really living this experience. So supportive measures may continue to be available and appropriate. And I really just want to quickly talk about prevention efforts because I do want to leave at least a minute for a question or two. And so I just want to point out, in thinking about prevention efforts, just important to think about who does a school ultimately designate as responsible for prevention efforts, for delivering them, and what does that look like? There's certainly questions that will vary from institution to institution about whether in-person, large group, small group are feasible, or whether those really don't scale to the whole institution and online programming needs to be an option. How do you best engage students to ensure that they take trainings or engage in prevention efforts and that it lands? Again, just like resources, very important to make any programming inclusive. Think about concerns of physical access, digital access, make sure to offer accommodations for any live in a physical location event or digital programming. Make sure to offer that and make very clear to students that accommodations are available. Mindful about using the inclusive language, advertising the variety of spaces on campus, and ensuring that any scenarios reflect diverse populations and really reflect your campus community. And then just again to say that there might be benefits to using a collaborative or team approach to design and carry out training and prevention efforts. And thinking about really the learning objectives and the purpose of a training. Is it to educate the community about the policy, or is it to educate to try to address maybe a climate or cultural issue that's been identified? And how might that impact the way that the training is developed? So I think I've said enough that your clear policies and procedures are really your roots and foundation. But every situation is unique. Each student has unique needs. And so it's really important in this work to stay flexible and think creatively within that framework of policies and procedures and the applicable legal framework, even though that legal framework can also sometimes be the wind that you're adapting to, as it can also change quite quickly. Make sure to be offering access to support for every student and offering equitable resolution options, and then being really transparent about what those processes and those options are. And then if I could have found any more alliteration to jam into the sentence, I would have. Collaboration and communication on campus and in the local community are critical. It not only is a fabulous alliteration, I really think that is the key to doing this work in a way that is compliant. I should have put that one in there somewhere. Compliant, but also goes beyond checking the box to really serve our students and our campus. So I don't know if we have time for questions or not, but if we do, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Excuse me. We do again apologize for the audio issues. Before we jump into the questions, Elizabeth has been generous enough to give a PDF version of today's slide deck. You will find that back on the main registration page. You can find that once we are finished. It will be directly below the survey. But we did have a couple of questions come in. The first one coming from Rebecca asking if you have an example of an adaptable process.
Sure. In terms of like a scenario where that would be appropriate or what the process might look like. I guess there might not be an opportunity for a follow-up question there. So I'll say one in terms of, it could be a number of different processes. So right now I know many institutions have really tried to steer clear of adaptable resolution processes for a long time based on, guidance of not using mediation to resolve complaints of sexual assault. That makes sense. But I think if you have a person who's filing a complaint and wants to pursue some type of restorative justice process that might be, in a shuttle format, that might be not with the respondent specifically, but might be with other, mutual friends or where those relationships have been impacted. I think those can, sorry, I knocked my screen off here. So I think those can be really helpful. I think it's important to have flexibility though about what the processes might look like. And I think a key thing too is to hear from the students what they would want it to look like. And to try to not sort of only have one option so that they have the flexibility to also kind of think about this is what I think would be helpful for my situation. If they're both in agreement with that, then I think we have a little more flexibility at this time than many institutions have felt comfortable with in the past to implement those. Again, if students are requesting that and both or all involved parties are voluntarily participating and it's a situation where you don't have safety concerns, and it absolutely does not have to be the case that that does not have to mean that students are engaging, sitting in a room together and talking face to face. In fact, I think that as there seems to be, we're headed in the direction of more hearings. I think it's important for people to have a spectrum of options of ways that they can engage with a process that doesn't necessarily require that. And just as a side note, I don't think that it's also important to make sure that hearings are happening in a way that's legally compliant, but also hearing from students about what legally compliant way you can structure a hearing to best work for them too. I hope that answers the question.
We did have two other questions, and I think we have enough time to do those. So the next question is asking if you could please emphasize on what you meant by hearing/hybrid model.
Oh, sure. So I think of a hybrid model as a process where there's an investigation process that then is followed by a hearing, rather than a hearing. A hearing sort of is the full adjudicative process. So, for example, and I guess I can use Michigan as an example. We had a very sort of traditional single investigator model where an investigator would meet separately with each party, with the witnesses, would provide everyone had an opportunity to review preliminary report with all of the information and evidence, and then the investigator, OIE, made the finding, and the parties they could identify questions for the investigator to ask of one another, but they didn't have live cross-examination. What we currently have is at the front end continues to have that investigation process where one investigator is meeting with parties, interviewing them, producing a summary, of their statement that they can review for accuracy and completeness, providing all of the evidence in a preliminary report for them to comment on. But then the hybrid piece is we've done that investigation in a very similar way to a sort of traditional all the way through single investigator model. But instead of the investigator, OIE, issuing a report with a finding, now it proceeds to a hearing. So that doesn't need to be, it's sort of you've done an investigation and then you have a hearing, live hearing with the opportunity for cross-examination, as legally required in the Sixth Circuit. But it's following that investigation versus the investigation going all the way through, or having a hearing without having first had an investigation conducted leading up to the hearing.
All right, and our last question is asking, what are the best practices for schools addressing incidents that happen to students off campus or on breaks or other things of that nature that are still affecting the students?
That is a great question. And I think this is a point where people are looking to see what the regulations ultimately will say, and that may change how schools have looked at this. I think at this point, so the number one thing I would always say is follow your policy, and to know to be thoughtful about that and how you frame your policy, about being clear about what is encompassed in it and what is not encompassed in it, and what you want and think is appropriate and legally can or should or have to include under it, and then being clear about how you communicate that to students so that they know what the situation is wherever you land on that. There's no question that it will always continue to appropriate. I'm pausing because it seems like a risky move to say there's no question that it always, but hard to imagine a situation where it becomes inappropriate for students to provide support or supportive resources or supportive measures that don't impact anyone else to a student that's saying, hey, I've experienced something, whether it falls within university policy or not. I think there are certainly places where an educational environment can be impacted by something that might not happen literally on a campus, a piece of property owned by a campus or in a classroom that can still fall under Title IX and appropriately fall under a school's policy based on the impact on the educational environment. I think that is definitely a place where a lot of people are waiting to see how, if and whether and how the regulations address that. For this time, I think the important thing is just to, when you're crafting a policy, think about what you want to do with that, being mindful of the fact that regulations are coming at some point, and make an intentional decision about it, and then be clear in your policy. And when you're at a point of not drafting a policy and you've gotten a report looking to your policy to say, does this fall within the policy or does this not fall within our policy based on the language that we have?
All right, and with that, we are going to go ahead and wrap things up. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for your presentation and all of the work that you were doing in your field. We definitely appreciate you taking the time out of your day to present for us.
No problem at all. Thank you very much.
All right, and with that, we are going to go ahead and close things out. Also, we would like to take this time, obviously, to thank all the attendees for joining us today. Our webinars are simply not possible without your attendance and your support, so thank you for joining, and thank you for all of your questions and interactions with our presenter today. Before you do leave today's webinar, we always ask that you participate in our short survey. You will find a link to jump to that directly below the captioning. So if you simply click on the word survey, that will take you to our customer satisfaction survey. We want to make sure that we are providing you the best webinar experience possible, as well as to adjust the content or any way that we disseminate that information out to you, our audience. So if you could take a few moments to complete that survey, we would definitely appreciate that. We also want to thank, let's see, losing my place. So If you take a look in the chat pod here momentarily, Tyler will be putting some links there in the chat pod that will take you directly to our social media pages, Facebook, LinkedIn, as well as Twitter. He will also be putting up our website, www.forensiccoe.org, where you can find all of our no-cost webinars, as well as reports and podcasts that we are putting out regularly. Again, Elizabeth was kind enough to share her slides with you. You will find that back on the main webinar page. It should say presentation slides. You can download those directly before you leave today. And then be sure to check out our newsletters that are coming out weekly for new webinars that we are constantly putting out. Again, thank you everyone for attending today. Thank you, Elizabeth, for your time and your presentation. And we hope everyone has a great rest of your afternoon.